Friday devotional. Sorry it's coming out a bit late, I've had a few technical issues at this end. Hope you're all doing well, and let's jump straight in. And we're picking up basically where we left off. Jesus has just been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, the disciples have scattered, and he's taken back into the city to face the trial ahead. First place he's taken, it's not the temple, it's the high priest's house, or rather it seems to be the house of the high priest's father-in-law, a man called Annas. The high priest is Caiaphas. So why is he taken there? Well, put simply, this is not a legitimate trial. This is not the proper way that you go about arresting someone and charging them and having them put to death in those days. This is shady dealings, and he's being taken first to Annas, who is like the patriarch of a family that produced many of the high priests in that period. And there he's being questioned, he's being beaten, he's being accused. This is just basically an attempt to break him down, to find out more about him, and to find out what they can stick on him to have him executed. What is interesting in this part of the story is that Jesus is inside, being questioned by Annas, among others, and it says that Peter is in the courtyard. Now, the courtyard is part of the property of the house. It's inside the first gate, which would have been guarded. The Gospels tell us there was a woman at the door, and so to get in there, Peter needs a reason. He needs to know the high priest, and obviously he's not exactly going to be in their best books right now. However, John tells us that another disciple, who is known to the high priest, another follower of Jesus, comes back and tells the woman at the gate to let Peter in. Now, we don't know who this is. It's not someone who's named, but what we can work out, they have to be someone of high status, or at least someone who the high priest would trust. Someone who is known to be a follower of Jesus, but also would not be a threat to the priests and to the temple establishment. They're the key things. There has to be powerful and well known to the high priest, and also not a threat. There's not a lot of people that fit that, and Nick Page's theory in his book, and I kind of likely to go along with that, is that this could have been Judas himself, which would have been mind-blowing to early Christians, who Judas very quickly morphed into a kind of monstrous figure of betrayal and evil. And so the idea of Peter, who is a leader of the early church, associating with Judas after the betrayal, that would just perhaps have been too much. So maybe John's avoiding using names there because of what it implies. And so Peter gets in any case, and he's in there and he's warming himself by the fire, trying to find out what's going on, and people start to recognise him. And this is where his bravado and bravery, all this stuff that's carried him this far, right up to the courtyard of the high priest, start to fail him. Now, there's a few issues. Some people are recognising him because they've seen him with Jesus, but even worse than that is a lot of people are starting to notice his accent, which is Galilean. Now, Galilean accent was an object of fun for those from Jerusalem and much of the rest of Judea. The Galilean accent was one that was associated with being sort of not very intelligent, country bumpkin, wouldn't trust them with anything. And I'm going to use Nick Page's illustration here. This is not my own. He says it would be like Jesus having a Brummie accent. Apologies to people from Birmingham. Take it up with Nick Page. This is not sort of a sophisticated, proper accent. This is the accent of the lower classes. And they start to say, well, weren't you with him? And this is where Peter denies Jesus. Not once, but 3 times. He doesn't quite have the bravery to stand up and own it. And I don't think we can blame him too much. I mean, his life's on the line. He's in an enclosed space. He couldn't have escaped if someone tried to grab him. There's just one gate in and out, and there's someone guarding that gate. So I don't think we can, judge Peter too harshly. Although at the same time, it is obviously he's kind of followed Jesus to a point, but hasn't been able to go quite all the way. So I'll leave Peter there, and Jesus through the night is beaten and questioned, and basically the accusations fall into two main camps. One, which is that he has equated himself with God, saying he's the Messiah, but more importantly perhaps for them is that he is, in their words, threatened to destroy the temple in 3 days. And so, did Jesus do that? Well, a few days ago, Jesus is prophesying about the temple and saying that these stones will be torn apart. But he's prophesying about an event that happens in the future, in AD 70, which is where AD 70 is where the Romans finally destroy the temple in Jerusalem. But this is going to be used against him. He can't. It can be twisted against him, and so that's what's being thrown at him. And he doesn't defend himself. At no point does Jesus say, actually, no, that's not a fair accusation, or no, I'm not guilty. He just stays silent for most of it, only to answer to say that basically that he is the Messiah, and that he will, and one day they will see him at the right hand of power. Now that gets him in more trouble, because that is equating himself with God. So they feel like they've got enough. They convene the Sanhedrin early in the morning. Sanhedrin is like the ruling council of the Jews. This is unlikely to have been a full court, or even necessarily a quorum. They didn't necessarily have enough legally to hold a vote. But none of this is being done according to the rules. You don't send snatch squads out in the middle of the night to grab someone. You don't question them all night in darkness in someone's house. There are set procedures and rules. In any case, Caiaphas and Annas and the high priest have gathered together at least some of the Sanhedrin, probably those who are more sympathetic to their cause. We know of other members of the Sanhedrin, like Joseph of Arimathea, who the Bible tells us they had no part in the decision to send Jesus for execution. So it's not the whole Sanhedrin, and that again is where they beat him, they question him, and they decide that they're going to send him to Pilate, the Roman governor. They sent him to Pilate because only the Roman governor has the power of life or death. He can sentence someone to death. They can do a lot, but they can't do the one thing they want to, so they have to send him to Pilate. Interestingly, when they get there, their stories have completely changed. So before, the accusations were always that Jesus had threatened to destroy the temple, or that he was claiming to be the Messiah. It was blasphemy, which is a religious crime, but it's not really anything the Romans are that bothered with. However, when they get to Pilate, they say, this man is calling himself a king. Now that is a problem for the Romans, because someone couldn't be a king unless the Romans had allowed them to be. They did have certain people they installed as king, like Herod Antipas, who is in charge in Galilee. But they're basically saying that Jesus is trying to subvert the empire and overthrow the Romans. So they've changed their story to make it fit here. This is just as if hammering home again, this is not a fair trial. This is not following the correct laws. This isn't justice. This is a stitch-up job. They're going to get Jesus executed one way or the other. And in fact, when Pilate first talks to him, he kind of says, well, I haven't found any crime in him. I haven't found anything that he's done wrong. I should release him. They won't have it. And the crowd is whipped up into a frenzy of chanting, crucify him. Now, there's a few more details in the trial, but at a certain point, Pilate says to them, that why should I crucify him, and why should I crucify him, and why are you not dealing with this yourself? And they say, well, only you can execute him. And Pilate makes a political decision. He is often depicted as quite weak-willed and swaying with the whims of the crowd, but actually the people in front of him are people he needs on side. And when one of them shouts out and says, if you do not kill this man, you are no friend of Caesar's, that is the final nail in the coffin. Because he knows that if they write to Caesar and say that he hasn't been fulfilling his duties, it doesn't really matter if it's true or not, and especially if there's a riot, Caesar will replace him in a heartbeat. And so he decides to give in. And he washes his hands in that famous scene and says, I've washed my hands of him, you're guilty of his death, not me. And the crowd reply, yes, we take it on. We take on the responsibility for his death. That has caused a lot of controversy and issues over the years, because a lot of Christians have taken that to mean that the Jewish people as a whole are guilty for Jesus' death to this day. That is not at all what's being said here. The people gathered here are not representative of the Jews. These are not everyday people. These are hand-picked members of the crowd who would support the high priest. This is a political move. It's not the people who were waving palm branches a few days ago. This is an assembled crowd that's been chosen very specifically. And so Jesus is taken. He is whipped, which was unbelievably brutal. The whips would have had bits of metal and hooks tied into them. It was not unusual that people would die during the process of a whipping. But Jesus is whipped, and he's still alive, so that's when he has the crown of thorns on his head, a purple robe as if he's a king, and led out for execution. It's not actually a long way from where Pilate would have been located to the site of Golgotha where Jesus was crucified. There's a modern route of pilgrimage, but it doesn't quite seem to fit with the historical and the gospel facts. It's a more recent sort of devotional addition is the word I'm looking for. But it wasn't a long way, but still Jesus couldn't make it, and he collapses and has to be helped by Simon of Cyrene. And so it's not, I say, a long way, and that shows how weak Jesus is. There's going to be massive internal bleeding from the beating he's received, open wounds all over his back. It wasn't uncommon for whippings to be so severe that the bones of the person being whipped would be exposed on their back. And Jesus is taken to Golgotha, just outside the city. He's hoisted up on the cross. Now, we think of this often as being very high up in the air. Actually, he'd have been probably just above eye level, just slightly off the ground, because they didn't need to do it any higher. With his hands nailed to the crossbeam that he'd been carrying that was then hoisted up, and his feet nailed to the vertical pole. And that's where he is, from 9 in the morning. And crucifixion was designed to be a humiliating, painful death. The death from crucifixion is not actually caused by the wounds of the nails. It's caused by asphyxiation, because when you're on the cross you have to hold yourself up to breathe, to expand your lungs, and eventually your muscles are just going to go into spasm, and they're not going to sort of be able to hold you up anymore. And at that point you are simply going to be unable to breathe, and you're going to suffocate. This is not a nice death by any means. In fact, the term excruciating comes from, it means from the cross, from crucifixion. So it was a word that kind of determined just how painful this was. A whole new word was developed for it, was used for it. And Jesus then is on the cross, and there are crowds gathered around, some of whom are there to mock him. Some of them are members of the priestly class, or others who were opposed to him, but others were his family and his friends, maybe some of the followers, who are there weeping. And in fact, on his way to the cross, many people were weeping and wailing, because this is not a decision of the Jewish people. This is a decision of the temple establishment, of the powerful people. This is not a decision by a whole city. And so actually there would be a huge amount of sympathy for Jesus. At 12 o'clock we would have had the first sacrifices happening for Passover over in the temple, where lambs would have been brought in by each of the men or groups of men to be sacrificed. You can only imagine the noise that would be going out, the terrified animals that are they're going to have their throats slit, and then the blood is splashed on the altar, and that's happening to thousands and thousands of lambs. You can only imagine the noise that's coming up from across the valley from the city, while the Jesus and the two thieves, one on either side, are on the cross. At 12 o'clock it tells us also that darkness fell across the land. Now, There are some sort of suggestions for what this could be, whether it was an eclipse, but given that Passover falls on a full moon, it's actually impossible to have an eclipse on a full moon. So we can rule that out. It's possible it was something like a dust storm that would have sort of blown over Jerusalem, but we don't know ultimately, and it can just be a miracle. We don't necessarily have a physical explanation for that, but I don't think that matters. In fact, maybe it even adds to the awe that we should feel thinking about this story of what's actually going on here, that God himself in Jesus is dying on a cross. And there's a few words recorded by the different Gospels that Jesus speaks from the cross. Perhaps the most famous is Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. That is that's Aramaic, which is Jesus' native language, and it means, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's the start of Psalm 22. So why is he saying this? There's theological discussion about what exactly that moment was, but the key thing I want to pick up on is the use of the word Eloi, which means my God or Lord. Jesus it was kind of his trademark that he referred to God as Abba, Father, a really close term, and suddenly he's using a very distant term to describe God at that moment, and he's lapsed into his native tongue, which he he's just cried out at that moment. And then the last thing Jesus is recorded as saying is, it is finished, which in Greek is tetelestai. I find it quite interesting that another way to translate tetelestai is paid in full, that somehow everything is finished in this moment, everything is paid, and there's different theological traditions about what's happening on the cross and how Jesus is paying for our sins. But what Jesus is saying in that moment is that I've paid it all, it's done. And at that moment he dies. Now, that's an incredibly quick death from crucifixion. Remember, he was at 9 in the morning, he was nailed onto the cross. He's dead by 3 in the afternoon, while others sometimes lasted days. The 2 other thieves have their legs broken in order to speed up their death. It stops them being able to support themselves so that they suffocate quicker, and that's because the priests don't want bodies hanging up on crosses over the Sabbath that was the next day. They want to have everything pure. But when they get to Jesus to break his legs, they realise he's already dead. And to make sure, because this is such an unusual occurrence for someone to die this early, they jab a spear into his side. And the Gospels tell us that blood and water flowed out. That actually is a really telling sign, because that blood and water could be a couple of things. It could be hitting the sort of pericardial sac, and then the heart itself would release water or clear fluid and then blood. Could also be that actually if someone is beaten very hard on the chest, sort of an impact injury, they can develop kind of an amount of fluid build up there. And this is in a very severe hit. And over time that would separate into a sort of a bloody mixture and more clear fluid. And given Jesus was beaten, that seems potentially likely. But the fact is, given how quick Jesus died, that he was already dead before they put him on the cross, in terms of he had fatal injuries. The beating killed him. He was beaten to death and nailed on the cross just for good measure, really. And so when he died on the cross, it was from blood loss, probably, from the injuries that he'd sustained beforehand. And so as he dies, it's coming to the end of the day. And normally, if you've been crucified, your body's not going to be given any respect or treated with any dignity. But Jesus has a few friends in high places, including Joseph of Arimathea, who is, say, a member of the Sanhedrin, who is appalled at their decision, was no part of it, and he goes to Pilate himself and requests Jesus' body. Pilate's surprised that Jesus is dead already, which reflects again that this was a really quick death for crucifixion. And once he's confirmed he's dead, he gives the body over to Joseph of Arimathea, who takes it, wraps it in the burial cloth, and places him in a new tomb. And then It says the stones rolled across, and at that point you've got probably some of the women who follow Jesus and Joseph and Arimathea walk away from the tomb. Sunset's coming, and at sunset, that's when the new day begins in the Jewish sort of way of doing things. And so at that point, the Sabbath is beginning. They have to go home. You can only imagine what they were feeling at those moments. The pure fear, the uncertainty, the lack of hope. It would have been despair, because we know Easter's coming. They had no idea what was to come. And that's where we leave it, in despair, in pain. Because I want to take this through as the people who would have lived it would have sort of experienced it. So tomorrow we'll look at the Saturday, which I think is actually one of the most remarkable days in church history, and one that's not often spoken about. So I'll be back tomorrow with the next episode, which may well be today by the time this is actually uploaded, thanks to all my technical issues I've been having. So thank you if you've been tuning into all these. I hope you found them useful and perhaps given you some extra things to think about over the Easter period. And yes, I will be back tomorrow for Easter Saturday, and then for our final devotion on Easter Sunday. Bye for now.